to sit down and say, okay, we have an incredible asset that no one except Dr. Carson today has. And that's a donor list of over 150,000 people. That's a volunteer list of 25,000 people. That's 500,000 people who have signed petitions. And we would have to sit down and say, okay, who are the candidates out there that we might be able to get behind? And I suppose at that point I get on the phone to whoever and have a chat with them, and then go from there, whatever in the world that means.
Okay, John, you sound pretty familiar with Dr. Carson and with his family, his wife. I'm going to go back to the background thing a little bit, and I understand that, a lot of these things I'm asking about, they are in no way violations of law. We're not asking about anything questionable. Have you ever met Dr. Carson, any members of his family?
Have.
And how did that come about?
It was at a conference. This was before our first mailing. No, I'm sorry. It was right after our test mailing. I had just published a book on my great-grandfather, John Philip Souza, and I wanted to give Dr. Carson a copy of it. So after he had made his speech, he was out in the lobby, and I went up to him, and I introduced myself, and he smiled, and I said, Dr. Carson, I've just published a book on my great-grandfather. I know your love of American history. I'd like you to have it. And he was very, very grateful. He took the book and told me he would look forward to reading it. And I hope he has.
Before I toss this back over to Doug, just one more question. Obviously, something must have spoken to you. Something must have moved you beyond just, respect for his love of history, his background, his intelligence. What is it that distinguishes Dr. Carson for you from the rest of the potential field of candidates? Because you did more than just say, hey, this is my guy, I'm going to vote for him. You actually went out, built an organization, went to work, and have really thrown yourself into it. What was it about Dr. Carson that made him stand out and shine more for you?
The tipping point was probably the National Prayer Breakfast, where he stood 2 feet from the President of the United States and said, Obamacare is a disaster. I'm really paraphrasing here, but you're taking medical care away from the patient-doctor relationship and inserting the government in between, and that's wrong. Where he said political correctness is destroying the fibers of our country. It's making people dishonest, and redistribution of wealth will be the destruction of the free enterprise system. And it was those positions, beautifully stated, with the president sitting and Mrs. Obama sitting not 2.5 feet away from him, that he would have the guts, that he would do it in a very soft-spoken voice. He wasn't jumping up and down. He wasn't berating the president. It wasn't personal. He simply said, in essence, your policies are terrible and they're destroying the country that I love. And I would tell you, he had me hook, line, and sinker. And then we did some vetting, not deep vetting, but we did some vetting on Dr. Carson, his background, his incredible upbringing by his mother, who I think ought to be nominated for sainthood when the Pope gets here in September, for how she helped her boys get out of the ghetto, and Dr. Carson becoming, a rock star in the medical profession. The whole package for me, And what I'm finding, it's not just me, it's millions of other people around the country. This is just kind of for your inside baseball, as they say. When we do a mailing to our existing donors, we're probably the only campaign, super PAC to be sure, in the country where I include either my personal cell phone number or my personal email address. So that if the people out there want an answer to something, they want to gripe at me, they want to talk to me, they want to say, gee, my great-uncle played in your great-grandfather's band, whatever it might be, they have the ability to reach out to me. So I'm not talking in a vacuum here. I'm talking because we did an email thing. I think it was last Thursday or Friday. Over the weekend, I had over 300 emails come into my email box. And I just flew from the East Coast to the West Coast yesterday, and I spent the entire plane trip answering all 300 emails. And so I have, I think, a real flavor for what a good portion of the American people are thinking about Dr. Carson, and it's really exciting.
All right, yeah, and you've certainly seen a lot of that in the reception he's gotten in the conservative media, and even I've also seen him since he has put himself out there as what I guess you would call at this point a quasi-candidate, since he hasn't officially announced anything.
Right.
He's I've also seen him on with Wolf Blitzer and others on CNN and such other networks, but I mean, and I wanted to ask you, as someone who was obviously a strong supporter, and with the caveat, that you don't speak for Dr. Carson and you're not speaking for the campaign, inevitably, when somebody runs for president, questions are going to come up. And, one question is, what about the issue of experience? I mean, and specifically, I mean, experience as in government.
Okay.
If you look at the potential conservative, opponents that he would face, the Ted Cruz's, et cetera, they've got a government service resume that they can point to, whereas Dr. Carson has spent his life quite successfully in the private sector, and some may argue that a lack of experience in government is a reason why you shouldn't start out with the highest office in the land.
And I guess, fundamentally, it's hard for me to disagree with that statement, but I would ask this question. We have over 500 professional politicians in Washington, D.C. today with collectively hundreds and hundreds of years of political experience. How are we doing? And I would argue that all that experience, if it's not properly applied, is worthless. And that maybe, just maybe, it's time to start with a clean slate. Time to start with a guy that doesn't have the political experience, but certainly has great management experience, great healing experience, a guy that doesn't come to office with a lot of luggage and baggage attached to him. There's not a lobby lobbyist in the country that he owes a darn thing to. So, listen, it's a very, very good question, but it's one that each individual voter in the country, when it comes time to vote either for Dr. Carson or for someone else, is going to have to ask themselves. And I've asked the question of myself, and I come to the conclusion that all that experience in Washington, D.C. today, maybe, is why we're in the predicament we're in today.
Okay. I'm going to twist that a little bit. It's a related question,
okay,
John, but 2 points about that just very briefly that I'll ask you to comment on. I can appreciate as much as anybody else the idea of getting what they like to say a Washington outsider, somebody that's not steeped in just all the garbage inside the Beltway. I get it,
right.
No question there. But going for an outsider without experience, Doug mentioned political experience. You both discussed that, and I don't think you need political experience because politics is kind of poisonous a lot of times, and I think we can all agree on that. But we have somebody in the White House right now, and have had somebody for 6 years, who came in with relatively little leadership experience, say nothing of political experience. He was kind of an outsider. I mean, he worked in the state and whatnot. And so the first half, I'm not entirely sure how much we're sold on the outsider theory anymore, just because we have such a bad role example. But going back to what Doug mentioned, and this is what I'd really like you to address, we have some other candidates who maybe they're not outsiders to politics, but outsiders from Washington, like governors, people who have held executive roles. And when I say executive role, I don't mean a role like Dr. Carson's. I mean the head of a very large, multi-armed, multifaceted organization, a state government where you have even somewhat of a military component with the National Guard, where you have the civil service, you have all these different things going on. It's a rather unique experience. And don't you think there is some value to say that someone who's been a governor of a large state, let's say Rick Perry, and for all the listeners, I am not supporting Rick Perry, I'm not endorsing him, I'm tossing a name out as somebody who spent a fair amount of time successfully running a big state, a massive organization with so many arms. That seems to me to translate directly over to a job like president. And isn't that a valuable background of experience that Ben Carson might not have gotten from his admittedly admirable work and all the work that he has done thus far?
Okay, so I'll answer your questions in two parts. First part, comparing, are we once burned, twice shy because of President Obama? And I would say to you that President Obama's experience was as a community organizer. He never managed anything. He never managed a budget. He never managed a staff beyond his maybe state Senate staff. So I think the comparison is really a bad one when you look at Dr. Carson's experience having sat on the board of two major U.S. corporations, having run a multi-$100 million budget at Johns Hopkins, having managed hundreds of staff people, including very successful, very intelligent doctors, medical professionals and nurses and so on and so forth. And by the way, the budgets that he managed, he had to live up to those budgets every year. He had to stick by those budgets. He couldn't just print more money. Your other point, I think, is much more valid, and that is, does a Jeb Bush or a Rick Perry or a Scott Walker does their experience running their individual states, does that count for something? And I would say, sure, it does. I'd be a fool not to say that experience is certainly helpful. But I would also say that Rick Perry, and I like Rick Perry, and Scott Walker, I like Scott Walker, they bring to town some baggage with them.